The Sensabaugh Tunnel is located in Hawkins County, just over the Holston River from Sullivan County and just upriver from Rotherwood. Now, the tunnel is the source for many scary tales, some of which we're going to share with you today. Hello, folks. I'm Steve Gilley, along with Rod Mullins, and these are the stories of Appalachia.
Steve, I've never heard of the Sensabaugh Tunnel before until you and I started talking about it a little bit, about where it's located and the myths, the mysteries, and everything else that goes with the Sensabaugh Tunnel. But there's a history behind this place.
It is a big history, and it is a big, big thing in Kingsport, Tennessee. It's right up there with all those stories you hear about the Rotherwood Mansion. All kinds of stuff that's gone on up there and all kinds of stories that we're going to share with you about that today. All of which start back in the 1920s as the CC&O Railroad built tracks in the area, and they needed to do something with this hillside. So they blasted it away to make room for a road, and then above that they placed the railroad tracks. The road was built, concrete poured, dirt placed on the concrete, then the roadbed and rails laid on that, making a tunnel underneath. This tunnel was named for the Sensabaugh family, which owned a farm opposite from the roadway. The tunnel was 12 feet high and 380 feet long, more or less. Now, while the Sensabaugh Tunnel was near the city of Kingsport, it was still fairly isolated, not far off Big Elm Road, so only the folks living in the immediate area used it. But by the 1950s, those pesky teenagers had discovered that a tunnel out in the middle of nowhere was a great place to set up Rod, let's call it a tunnel of love. How about that?
Suits you, it suits me.
Well, pretty soon making out was accompanied by partying and hanging out, and this is where the story surrounding the Sensabaugh Tunnel started. Now, the most well-known story was that a hobo or a tramp had happened on the Sensabaugh farm and had decided to help himself to some of the family's possessions, namely valuable jewelry. He was found in the middle of this crime by the head of the family, one Ed Sensabaugh. So this bum grabbed one of Ed's children, his baby, and took off, Ed hot on his heels. As the hobo ran through the tunnel, he got to the other side and tossed the baby into a pool of water so as to distract Ed long enough to get away. When he threw the child into the water, it drowned before Ed could get it out. That's one story, horrible story, but that's one of the ghost stories. And there's some others, aren't there, Rod?
Yeah, I didn't even know. I'd never heard of that before. Of course, talking about this Sensabaugh Tunnel, but this story has another variation to it. In this version, there was no hobo and no robbery. Ed Sensabaugh simply went crazy one night, murdering his family, then committing suicide inside the tunnel. And all the other stories build upon these. For example, there is a tale that is told of a woman whose car broke down in the Sensabaugh Tunnel one night as she was headed home. Oh, there was a terrible thunderstorm going on at the same time. Well, she decided that she needed to call for help, and this was in those pre-cell phone days. She got out of her car, began walking toward the Sensabaugh house in the pouring rain to use the phone. She never made it, and it's assumed that she, too, was murdered by a ghostly lunatic named Ed. Well, that's some of it. But it's also said that you can't walk the tunnel at midnight from back to front without losing your mind and going insane. I have no problem there. I'm already insane, so it probably wouldn't affect me. But there are also stories of folks driving into the tunnel, shutting off their engines, then being unable to restart them. Sounds like something out of the Devil's Triangle or something. And then being unable to start their engines or restart them, all the while these sounds of demonic laughter all around them. Now, before a tall, dark figure with red eyes rises up from the shadows behind the car. I'm not going there, Steve. I could make several remarks right now about strange figures with red eyes, but no, I'm going to leave that alone. I'm going to let you take the next part of the story.
Oh, I'd be more than happy to do that. See, it's also told that on at least one occasion, someone stuck in that tunnel found themselves moving slowly forward. Later, tiny baby hands were found on the rear of the car. That murdered infant that we told you about in the first story, moving it out of harm's way. Now, there is one story told, though, that is closer to the truth. Back in the 50s, when those kids would be partying and making all kinds of racket, that kind of bothered old Ed Sensabaugh. He liked to have some peace and quiet. So he came up with an ingenious plan. Knowing some of those stories that we just told you that were making the rounds, he would show up at the other end of the tunnel and begin to holler, making sounds like a baby's cry and women screaming. As the sound passed through the tunnel, it would be amplified so that by the time it made it out the other end to the teenagers, it was an unearthly noise that poured forth. And this was usually enough to scare the wits out of those 1950s teens and get them to get the you-know-what out of there. Now, behind the urban legend surrounding the tunnel, Rod, are some very interesting bits of history. At the time the railroad was built through the area where the Sensabaugh Tunnel is located, there was a vast influx of immigrant laborers, mostly from Italy. Now, these immigrants ended up all over the Appalachian Mountains, building roads, railroads, logging, and mining coal. One of these immigrants was a man named Francisco Antonio from Sicily. Now, the reason Mr. Antonio had left his homeland was because he'd gotten into hot water over a murder and was on the run from Italian authorities. He made it to New York in 1905 and, over the next 20 years, made his way farther and farther south till he made it to Kingsport, Virginia, where he began to work on the labor gangs for the CC&O. He was one of the Italian immigrants who worked building the Sensabaugh Tunnel. While those men were building the railroad and tunnel and blasting that hill, there was an accident with the dynamite the men were using. The resulting explosion killed 7 of Francisco's closest friends and co-workers, and these men were buried in unmarked paupers' graves in the Ross Campground Methodist Church Cemetery near the tunnel. Now, what if we told you that all these things that happened to Mr. Antonio and his men, along with the scary tales we've told, never happened at that particular tunnel? There are many who say that the tunnel in question isn't that famous haunted tunnel on Sensabaugh Hollow Road, but instead is actually a tunnel noted on maps by another name, hidden in the woods somewhere near Big Elm Road, possibly just a mile or a half a mile away from that left-hand turn onto Sensabaugh Hollow Road. Now, this tunnel, the other one, appears to be the same one pictured on old photos of the Sensabaugh Tunnel, and it is much closer to the Ross Campground Methodist Church Cemetery where those Italian immigrants were buried. In any event, most folks have decided that the tunnel is the one on Sensabaugh Hollow Road, since it is, in fact, the Sensabaugh Tunnel after all.
Wow. All these stories, all these things, and some of them, I don't know if they're true or not, but they're interesting. All of these stories and these tales, supposedly in this mysterious place where cars do not crank again, or you start slowly moving forward after being stopped. It's almost like something out of a science fiction story of just, you're stuck there, and what would they call it? Something to do with time. You're kind of in a time loop or whatever it might be. You're kind of reliving your past or whatever it might be. It's weird. It's just totally weird.
Kind of like in another dimension? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah,
a Twilight Zone, maybe?
Sort of a Twilight Zone sort of thing, So,
well, it is not the only tunnel in Appalachia that has stories like this told about it. There's one that I cannot remember the name of it that's up in Maryland, I believe, that was haunted by some fella that was killed by a train, I believe, that ran over him. There's some other tunnels out there as well. We've got the Big Bull Tunnel. We talked about that one. They had some stuff going on there. Mm-hmm. So tunnels in Appalachia generate a whole lot of these scary stories, and the Sensabaugh Tunnel is no exception.
Yeah, and a lot of this is, tied to the fact of the hardship and everything else that the people went through trying to make this tunnel. So they decide to go and embellish things a little bit, and there may be some true stories and true facts that go along with this. But yeah, this is interesting. I like this story, even though I've never been there before. But you've told me before about this place, and you said, "Oh, weird things happen." I don't know if you're just saying that on purpose to purposely scare me or not, but still, it's interesting.
Well, I'll say that I went up there and I've been through the tunnel and nothing happened to my car. I will say this, though, and this is in all seriousness. When I was up there shooting video for this, as I'm just inside the tunnel, standing there with my camera, I hear somebody talking, a very young voice talking from inside that tunnel. Nobody was there. Nobody's up on top. I looked, nothing. I just hear this very vague, from the middle of the tunnel is where it sounded like it was coming from. Some voices, you couldn't make them out what they were saying, but just some voices. That was odd, but that's the only thing I noticed, nothing else.
Wow.
Well, folks, that's the story of the haunted Sensabaugh Tunnel, one of the stories that make up the folklore of Appalachia. Thanks for watching. Now, for more stories of Appalachia, be sure to subscribe to the Stories podcast on your favorite podcast app, or click that subscribe button down below and give us a thumbs up, too, if you don't care to do so. Till next we meet, y'all take care. Sweet dreams, folks.